The hall smelled of beeswax and iron ink, and every breath carried the weight of 40 winters of family pride. We stood beneath the carved beams of grandfather's manor as the royal scribe unrolled the parchment that would decide our fates. My brother, Edmund, was already smiling. He had worn that expression all morning. The kind that says the world is his by birth, not by merit. The rest of us, my aunt with her rosary, my mother twisting her kerchief, watched in silence as the scribe adjusted his spectacles and broke the red wax seal. I remember thinking how small the seal looked compared to the lives it governed. It bore the mark of the king's own chancery, proof that this will, unlike the rest of us, could not be questioned. The scribe's voice was careful, ceremonial. He spoke of the manor at Ashwell, the grain rents, the horses, the oak grove. All of it passed to Edmund, and to his male issue thereafter. His smirk deepened. Then came a pause, a tiny cough, a finger trailing down the parchment to a faint margin of ink. "There is an additional clause," the scribe murmured. The room shifted. Even the fire seemed to draw in its breath. He read slowly, every word deliberate. "To my granddaughter, Margaret of Ashwell, I bequeath such portion of rents and rights as are to sustain her, education and liberty, under the seal of my Majesty's clerk, and none shall gainsay her claim." The silence that followed was sharper than a blade. My brother's smirk faltered, though he tried to recover it by clearing his throat and muttering something about scribal fancy. But I had seen it, the royal mark, pressed in crimson wax beside my name. The scribe himself looked uncertain, as if he had been handed a puzzle rather than a document. When the reading ended, Edmund leaned close enough that only I could hear. "You'll find, dear sister, that ink promises much and delivers little." His tone was honeyed, but his eyes were as cold as the silver candlesticks. I did not answer him. My pulse was a drum in my throat, and yet a strange calm spread through me. I did not know what that clause meant, nor why grandfather had hidden it so deep within his will. But I knew two things. First, that Edmund feared it. Second, that I would not let the parchment vanish into his keeping. The royal scribe folded the document, sealed it once more, and placed it within a cedar box. "Copies shall be entered at Chancery within the week," he said, bowing slightly to our mother. "There may be questions regarding the supplemental clause, my lady." "Questions," my brother repeated, as if tasting the word. I met his gaze and smiled, the first true smile of that day. "Indeed," I said softly. "And answers, too." Outside, the church bells tolled for none in particular, but to me they sounded like a summons. I was born into a house that measured worth by birth and not by effort. Even as a child, I knew my grandfather's ledgers mattered more than any prayer I whispered. He had risen from a merchant's counting table to a knight's seat, and he guarded that ascent with the same ferocity he once reserved for his coin chests. My father died when I was young, leaving my mother and me to the mercy of men who believed piety could be weighed in silver. Edmund, already destined as heir, grew up among the reeves and tenants, learning to command. I was sent to the convent school at St. Clair's, where obedience was our only inheritance. The convent was cold in winter, but I remember loving the quiet there. It was the only place I could hear my own thoughts without interruption. The nuns taught us letters, scripture, and needlework, though they said a woman's finest art was silence. I broke that rule often. I wrote in margins of borrowed psalters, copied bits of law from dusty treatises meant for men. One sister, kind, nearsighted, and brave in her own small way, smuggled me a torn page from the statutes of the realm. She whispered, "Knowledge is not a sin, if the cause be just." I pressed that page against my heart for years. When I returned home, I found the manor unchanged, but colder. Grandfather still ruled every meal as if it were a court session. He had grown wary of Edmund's temper, but still admired his spirit. At table, they would speak of rents, land, and politics, while I kept my eyes on my trencher. Yet sometimes grandfather would glance toward me, as if seeing the ghost of the merchant he once was, the one who valued wit above name. The ledgers from those days were dense with ink and secrecy. I remember one, bound in calfskin, with a page of sums that didn't quite match. The steward explained it away. "Clerical oversight," he said. But I saw grandfather's signature there beside a curious note. "To the crown, in loan 20 marks. To the education of issue female, £5 sterling." The words were faint but deliberate. It was the first sign that he had thought of me, perhaps even planned something the family would not approve. After his death, as I helped mother clear his chamber, I found another trace. In the parish register tucked between sermons, a small inkblot marked my name alongside Edmund's. Legitima. Not bastarda, not omitted, but legitimate. I held that book as if it might vanish from my hands, as if ink could fade from fear. Later that week, I spoke with Father Thomas. our chaplain and a man of cautious honesty. Could a clause be hidden? I asked him in the vestry while the candles flickered against stone walls. Could a will contain secrets meant for one eye only? He hesitated before answering. In rare cases, yes. When a bequest must be shielded until the realm's law. Then perhaps, I said quietly, it is time a woman did. He looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. If that clause bears the royal seal, my child, there will be a copy in London, in the clerk's keeping. Seek it, but do so in prudence, lest your brother hear of it first. That night, I dreamed of parchment, pages fluttering like wings, ink swirling into my grandfather's voice. Education and liberty, under royal hand. When I awoke, I knew the next step. I would go to London. The truth, after all, would not come to me in the safety of our hall. London was a city that smelled of ink, rain, and ambition. By the spring of 1480, I had learned to walk its crooked lanes without tripping on my own hem, though every step still marked me as an outsider, a woman without escort, without husband, and, as rumor soon whispered, without shame. I came to the city to find a clerk, to see the records of my grandfather's will. But word of my purpose seemed to travel faster than I did. Edmund's men were already there, spreading small talk dressed as scandal. It began with a smirk from a distant cousin over supper at the inn. They say you've a fondness for parchment more than prayer, he told me, the candlelight bouncing off his cup. Careful, Margaret, the law is a man's game. I smiled, though my fingers tightened around my bread. Gossip was as common as mud, but in a world built on reputation, it was deadlier than steel. 2 days later, I found a folded paper slipped beneath my chamber door, a printed broadsheet bearing my name in bold type, Lady Scholar or Lady Pretender, the unfilial daughter who covets her brother's crown. The words danced with venomous elegance, their ink still wet enough to smudge. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from the quiet fury of recognition. This was no accident. Edmund had paid a pamphleteer. I took the paper to the royal scribe's office near the Guildhall, where the air was thick with dust and the scratching of quills. The same scribe who had read the will looked up from his work, startled to see me. I laid the broadsheet before him. You know this hand, I said. You know the truth of my grandfather's clause. He studied the sheet, his mouth a thin line. You must not think every insult worth answer, my lady. The court may not look kindly on women who stir scandal. I seek not scandal, I replied, only record. You read the seal yourself. Does it not stand? He hesitated, then reached into a drawer and drew out a small, folded parchment bearing the chancery mark. This, he said quietly, is the courier note of transmission. It proves that your clause was entered and sealed before your grandfather's death. I was witness. Keep it safe. But be warned, your brother has influence among the guilds. I thanked him and tucked the note into my sleeve, feeling its weight as though it were gold. The city's noise faded around me as I stepped back into the street. In that moment, I realized the game had changed. This was not merely a dispute over inheritance. It was a contest of credibility. My brother had his name and title. I had ink and truth. That night, I attended a feast at my uncle's house, summoned under the guise of family reconciliation. The tables glittered with pewter and pride. Edmund was there, his charm polished, his laughter too loud. When the minstrels paused, he raised his cup and said, "To our sister, so learned in law she may soon replace the clerks themselves." The guests laughed, some nervously, others with cruel delight. I bowed my head, letting the moment pass. But when I rose to leave, I spoke just loudly enough for the scribe in attendance to hear. "To knowledge, then," I said, "for it will outlast all titles." A few heads turned. Edmund's smile flickered, the first crack in his armor, small but visible. As I stepped into the cold night air, I unfolded the courier's note once more under the torchlight. The ink gleamed faintly, my receipt, my shield. For the first time, I understood that silence would no longer serve me. The battle for truth had begun, and I would fight it not with swords, but with evidence no rumor could undo. The Guild of Scriveners was not built for women's footsteps. Its corridors were narrow and shadowed, the scent of old vellum heavy in the air. I moved carefully, aware that every creak of the floorboards might betray my purpose. Brother Anselm, the chancery clerk who had promised quiet help, met me by the stairwell, his lantern casting long, trembling lines across the walls. "This way," he whispered, leading me into a chamber lined with shelves of bound ledgers, each marked with years in fading ink. "Here lie the estate accounts your grandfather submitted to the Crown's auditors. If there is fraud, it will be in the margins." I slipped off my gloves and traced the spines with my fingertips, feeling dust thick as secrecy. The first ledger bore the year 1476. Its pages were a forest of numbers, rents and signatures, columns of coin and corn owed, payments made in kind. To anyone else it would have seemed honest. but I had copied such ledgers for my grandfather once. I knew his neat hand, the curl of his M, the way he crossed his T as though with finality. Here, his penmanship ended abruptly. Later entries bore my brother's hand, or a crude imitation of it. There were smudges where ink had been scraped and replaced. A name missing, that of a tenant family who had worked the Ashwell Mill for 3 generations. Their rent line erased, replaced by a new note, transferred to Master Edmund for maintenance of estate. The mill, my mill. I turned another page and found a folded slip pinned to the ledger. Its wax seal was cracked but legible. Clause supplementary, held by royal hand until petition of female heir. I felt my breath catch. The document within was brief, written in my grandfather's own hand. It granted education portion and freehold of Ashwell Mill in perpetuity to my granddaughter Margaret upon completion of schooling. There was no mistaking it, the very phrase spoken at the will reading. Brother Anselm leaned closer, eyes wide. By the saints, it's genuine, but this should have been entered with the main will, not hidden in a rent ledger. Then someone removed it, I said, my voice trembling. Someone with reason to erase it. We moved on, uncovering 2 more proofs, a bill of exchange signed to fund my dowry, and a letter of acknowledgement from the Crown's collector, noting its receipt. Each bore alterations made in fresher ink, each benefiting Edmund. It was a quiet theft, dressed as record-keeping. When the candle burned low, Anselm extinguished the flame and pressed a scrap of parchment into my palm. A copy of the entail clause, he said. Keep it near your heart. But beware, these records are guarded more fiercely than relics. If your brother learns of this, he'll not rest. I left the guild at dawn, the city still sleeping, the river a strip of pewter beneath the sky. The documents hidden beneath my cloak felt heavier than any weapon. I thought of grandfather, his fierce pride, his insistence that a contract binds stronger than blood. Perhaps this, at last, was his way of ensuring it. When I returned to my lodging, I lit the hearth and spread the copies across the table. The ink shimmered in the light, black as oath and ash. I whispered a prayer of thanks and a vow. No more whispers, only proof. In that moment, I ceased being merely the forgotten granddaughter. I became a keeper of evidence, and the house of Ashwell would learn that parchment remembers longer than gossip does. The rain that week seemed endless, drumming against the shutters of my small lodging near St. Paul's like the hand of conscience itself. I had not slept much since finding the hidden clause. Every drop that struck the glass reminded me that time, and my brother's reach were both closing in. The guild clerk, Anselm, had done what he dared. Now I needed someone who could make my findings matter in the eyes of the law. That someone could only be the royal scribe. He received me after dusk, when the chancery offices emptied and the corridors echoed only with the sighs of settling timber. His rooms were modest, books piled upon books, maps curling at their edges, and a single lamp that burned with the steady patience of habit. When I entered, he did not rise, only motioned to the chair opposite. I wondered how long it would take. I laid the folded copies on his desk. These are the proofs, I told him. Forged ledgers, concealed clauses, and altered payments. I have kept the originals hidden. He unrolled one parchment, frowning as his fingers brushed the ink. This is your grandfather's hand, without doubt. The wording is lawful, but daring. He used the phrase education and liberty in chancery. That can mean a living trust, though rarely in favor of a woman. Then he must have meant it to stand, I said. He believed in record more than reputation. The scribe leaned back, folding his arms. If you press this, your brother will answer through influence. He can summon guild allies, even threaten your good name further. I am aware, I said, my tone calm but resolute. But if silence erases justice, then I prefer noise. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came from respect rather than amusement. Then you must proceed by the book. We will draft a petition to the Court of Chancery, requesting inspection and clarification of the disputed clause. It must be written in my hand, sealed with my warrant, and witnessed. You will require a surety, a person of standing who believes in your right. I hesitated. Who would risk that? He turned a page of parchment, already beginning to write. I will, quietly. I owe your grandfather a debt for his honesty in a case long past. And perhaps, he added, glancing at me, the realm owes one woman's truth its hearing. I watched the ink flow across the page, the formal script forming words that might yet restore my name. The room smelled of parchment and lamp oil, a scent that felt like order itself. He read aloud each line, the petition's language crisp and deliberate. That the court shall review the testamentary clause of Sir Geoffrey of Ashwell, sealed under royal hand to determine its lawfulness and rightful execution. When he finished, he sprinkled sand over the ink to dry it, then handed me the copy. Keep this near you. Deliver it to no one until I summon you to Westminster. And Margaret, should your brother approach you, Do not answer in anger. The law is slow, but ink lasts longer than rage. His words lingered as I stepped back into the rain-soaked street. The petition felt warm against my chest beneath my cloak, like a heartbeat of justice waiting for its chance. For the first time, I did not feel alone. Back in my room, I placed the document inside the small box that once held my mother's rosary. "Amen to ink," I whispered, and let the candle burn down beside it. Somewhere in the city, I knew Edmund's agents were watching, but I had crossed the line between fear and resolve. What began as survival was now a strategy, and the law, slow, heavy, deliberate, was at last mine to wield. The letter reached me by a trembling hand, a servant from Ashwell, pale with worry. It bore my mother's seal and only 6 words, "He knows." Return or all is lost, my heart sank. Not from fear, but from the certainty that the game I had hoped to play quietly had found its noise. By dawn, I was on the road home, the petition still hidden in the rosary box beneath my cloak. The manor rose out of the mist like a wounded thing. Its windows, once warm with candlelight, looked now like blind eyes. Edmund stood at the threshold to greet me, dressed too finely for an ordinary day. "Dearest sister," he said, voice smooth as poured honey, "you've become quite the traveler. London suits you, I hear." "I have been attending to family matters," I replied, keeping my tone level. He stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. "Then let us attend to them together." The solar, where he led me, was as I remembered, hung with our grandfather's portraits, the scent of lavender and ink still lingering. But there was new disorder, too. Papers spread across the table, ledgers opened, as though a performance of diligence had been staged for my arrival. "I hear," he began, taking a seat, "that you've been consulting clerks, stirring up old dust. Surely you know how delicate these things are? Women meddling in law, well, tongues wag easily." "Perhaps," I said softly, "but truth does not wag. It waits." His jaw tightened. He tapped the open ledger with a quill. "This book," he said, "proves that grandfather's estate was always meant to pass entire to me. Your so-called clause, if it exists, is a forgery. Some clerk's trick, no doubt bought by your charm." I walked to the window where light fell in narrow strips across the floor. "If that is so," I said, "then you will not mind if I compare your ledger with grandfather's own." He rose sharply. "You presume too much?" "No, Edmund," I said, turning toward him. "You forged too. Much." I withdrew from my sleeve a folded parchment, the journal page, I had taken from grandfather's study months before, written in his unmistakable hand, "To my granddaughter, the mill at Ashwell, her liberty's portion." I laid it beside his ledger. "Compare them yourself. The hand, the date. Your forgery falters." For a long moment, only the crackle of the hearth answered us. Then he spoke, low and venomous. "You think parchment will save you? The court will side with its men, as it always has. One whisper from me, and they'll call you unfit to manage even a garden, let alone a mill." He took a step closer. I held his gaze. "Perhaps, but I have one ally you do not, record. Record does not forget." Something in my calm unsettled him. He swept the ledger shut and struck it with his palm. "Enough! I could send you back to the convent where you belong. You will ruin our name." He stared at me for a long time, then laughed, a hollow sound. "You have your mother's stubbornness. It will undo you." "Or save me," I answered. He turned his back, shoulders rigid. "Leave Ashwell, Margaret, for both our sakes." I said nothing. Instead, I took from my pocket the small receipt, book he had thought destroyed, proof of the diverted payments from the mill's tenants to his steward. I placed it on the table beside the journal page. "Keep these, brother," I said. "They will remind you that truth has already left this house." As I stepped out into the hall, I heard his voice behind me, brittle with fury. "You will regret this." "Perhaps," I said, not turning, "but I will not regret knowing." Outside, the air was sharp with the coming rain. I looked toward the mill in the valley and felt neither fear nor triumph, only clarity. For the first time, I saw how power hides behind manners, and how composure can be sharper than any blade. The first pamphlet appeared at the apothecary's door. I saw it fluttering there like a wounded bird. Cheap paper, hurried ink, but the seal unmistakable, a red E stamped in wax. The heading read, "A Sister's Treachery, False Claims upon an Honest Inheritance." Beneath it, my name was printed in bold black letters for the town to gawk at. The words were poison dressed as pity. They said I'd deceived my dying grandfather, forged his signature, manipulated the clerks in London, and disgraced the family's honor. By the time I returned to the square, boys were laughing as they read it aloud. I did not tear the pamphlet down. Instead, I folded it neatly and placed it into my satchel. Proof, I thought, comes in many forms, sometimes even in the lies of your enemy. That night, I wrote to Mr. Hale, my solicitor, explaining all that had transpired. His reply came within 2 days. swift and exacting. Do not answer gossip with gossip. Answer it with record. Send me copies of all ledgers, receipts, and correspondence, every document that bears Edmund's hand. So I did. For nights I sorted through my grandfather's papers by candlelight, hands ink-stained and trembling from lack of rest. Each page told its own quiet story. Overpaid rents, unpaid wages, suspicious transfers. By dawn, I had a dossier so weighty it could silence a dozen pamphlets. Meanwhile, Edmund's smear campaign grew. Notices in the Guild Gazette called me a meddlesome woman with unlawful ambitions. Anonymous. Letters arrived at my door suggesting I leave town for my safety. Even the churchwarden looked at me differently, as though my prayers might now carry scandal. But I stood my ground. When you have truth in your pocket, fear has less room to breathe. One morning, Mr. Hale arrived from London unannounced. His boots were muddy, his coat damp from the rain, but his eyes carried a spark I had not seen before. He has overplayed his hand, he said, unrolling a parchment on my kitchen table. A mortgage transfer, Edmund's doing. He pledged the mill as surety for his personal debts. The deed carries both his name and the steward's mark. He's already breached his rights as heir. I studied the document, each word a nail in the coffin of his deceit. Can we use this? I asked. Not yet, Hale replied. We will issue a letter of demand first. A warning shot. He must know that you possess what the Gazette cannot print. Evidence. The letter, drafted that evening, was a masterwork of restraint. It cited clauses, dates, and seals without emotion, ending with a single sentence that struck like quiet thunder, failing remedy within 7 days. We shall present all documents before the Guildhall Committee for adjudication. We sent a copy to Edmund and another to the Guild's registrar. Within 3 days, a reply came, not from Edmund, but from the Gazette itself. A retraction notice, printed in small type, buried between trade announcements. The earlier statements regarding Mistress Margaret Ashwell were made in error, pending clarification of certain documents. It was not an apology, but it was a crack in his armor. Still, I knew him too well to believe silence meant surrender. When cornered, Edmund would not yield. He would scheme. As predicted, the next evening a messenger rode through town, delivering summons to both of us. The Guildhall would hold a formal hearing to settle the matter of contested ownership and defamation. Public stage at last, the place where truth would stand bare. Before all who had whispered, behind closed doors, I closed my window against the wind, feeling it push against the panes like a warning. For the first time, I understood the full cost of my resolve. Reputation could be restored, but family, once fractured by greed, might never be whole again. Still, I whispered into the quiet, so be it. The Guildhall loomed over the square like a cathedral of judgment. Tall windows, oak doors banded with iron, banners heavy with the smell of dust and authority. I arrived with Mr. Hale at my side, my shawl drawn close though the day was mild. Already townsfolk gathered in clusters by the steps, whispering, their eyes bright with curiosity. Rumor had fed them for weeks. Now they had come to taste truth. Inside the air was cool and thick with murmurs. The magistrate's dais gleamed with candlelight, and behind it, the guild committee sat, men of ledgers and trade, not of sympathy. My brother was already there, immaculate in his dark coat, his expression calm and assured. He inclined his head slightly when he saw me. The clerk called the room to order. The guild's registrar spoke first, reading aloud the notice of complaint, a matter of disputed inheritance and defamation between Master Edmund Ashwell and Mistress Margaret Ashwell, concerning the late Lord Robert Ashwell's estate, and the rights of proprietorship to the Ashwell Mill. I felt my pulse steady as the clerk unrolled the parchment that bore grandfather's will. The room hushed, and to my granddaughter, Margaret, the mill at Ashwell, to be held in trust until her 25th year, provided she manage its accounts with honest diligence. The words rang clear, leaving no air for denial. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Edmund's jaw tightened, but he rose with the grace of a man rehearsed in deception. That clause, he said, was inserted after our grandfather's passing. The original document bore no such line. I present this earlier copy, witnessed and sealed. He handed the parchment to the clerk, who examined it under lamplight. Mr. Hale stepped forward, calm as winter stone. If it please the committee, he said, we have reason to believe the master's copy has been altered. The ink betrays it. He motioned to the registrar, producing the journal page we had guarded for months. This is the original hand of the late Lord Ashwell, dated a week before his death, confirming the clause as his final intent. Gasps echoed. I saw Edmund's color fade slightly, though his smile remained. Even if true, he said smoothly, my sister has already violated the estate's conditions, by attempting to sell grain without consent, and by slandering my name in town. I took a breath, then stepped forward myself. If truth is slander, then let every honest ledger be guilty of the same. I opened the small case I carried and handed the registrar the receipts, one by one. Payments received under my brother's signature, funds withdrawn from the mill's account to settle his personal debts. The sums are listed, the tenants named, the steward's mark recorded. The mill has been his purse, not his duty. The registrar examined the papers carefully. One of the committee members, a gray-haired man who had once traded under my grandfather's trust, leaned forward. "I have seen that steward's mark before," he said. "It belongs to a man now in debtor's jail." Murmurs turned into a low rumble. Edmund's composure began to crack. He reached for the table, gripping its edge as though the oak itself might lend him balance. Mr. Hale spoke again, firm but measured. "In addition, this mortgage deed, recorded in the Guild's own archive, proves that Master Ashwell pledged the mill as surety, without authority, and in violation of his fiduciary trust." The magistrate raised his brow. "Have you explanation, sir?" Edmund's voice trembled, though he struggled to mask. Silence filled the hall. Then the registrar stood and struck his gavel once. "The documents speak clearly. The will's clause stands. The mill is lawfully Mistress Margaret's master. Edmund shall forfeit his claim, and pay restitution for his misuse of funds." A single stunned breath seemed to pass through the room. Edmund's eyes met mine. Not with apology, but with a kind of quiet ruin. For the first time, I pitied him. As we exited into the courtyard, bells from St. Peter's told the hour. The townsfolk, who had once whispered against me, now nodded with restrained respect. One woman placed a folded gazette in my hand. On its front page, the headline read, "Justice at the Guildhall, Mistress Ashwell vindicated." The ink smelled sharp and new. I folded it gently and tucked it away. It was done. Not victory, but balance restored. The days after the Guildhall hearing passed like a long exhale after years of held breath. The town, which had once looked at me with pity or suspicion, now offered polite bows, brief nods, and murmured congratulations. Yet I found no joy in their sudden warmth. It was not applause I wanted, it was quiet, and the chance to rebuild what had been taken. Edmund did not appear in public for weeks. His carriage stood idle in the courtyard, the horses sold, the servants dismissed. I was told he spent his days in the upper rooms of the manor, shutters drawn, sending no word except one brief letter to the guild promising to repay what he owed. I read that letter in the Gazette, printed in small type below the market prices, and felt only the ache of what greed had cost him. Once, we had been children chasing geese by the mill stream. Now, ink and parchment had made strangers of us. I returned to Ashwell Mill for the first time since the hearing. The wheels stood still, the air heavy with the scent of old flour and dust. Inside, I found the ledgers piled neatly, as my grandfather had kept them, though the ink had faded. The steward, an honest man now in my employ, brought me the keys. "It can turn again, mistress," he said quietly. "Just needs care and fair hands." So I began. With the guild's restitution funds, I paid the workers their back wages and reopened the doors. By the month's end, the wheel turned once more, slow but steady, the river catching light across its wooden spokes. The sound of it, water-meeting craft, was like a prayer answered. Mr. Hale visited soon after. "You've made the mill live again," he said, standing by the doorway with a faint smile. "And now that the deed bears your name, what will you do with its earnings?" "I'll set aside a portion," I replied, "for apprentices, young ones who wish to learn honest trade but lack the means." Grandfather believed a mill was not only to grind flour, but to shape futures. He nodded approvingly. "You turn justice into generosity, Mistress Ashwell. That is rarer than victory." Later that week, I received an unsigned note, delivered by the postwriter. The handwriting was unmistakable. "You have won, Margaret. I hope it brings you peace. I am leaving Ashwell." No address followed, only a single line drawn beneath his name, as though he meant to close the chapter himself. I folded it carefully and placed it in my journal beside grandfather's will. The Gazette soon printed a final notice. "Master Edmund Ashwell resigns his guild membership and departs the county." No scandal, no mockery, just silence, as though the town had collectively agreed to let the dust settle. And in that silence, I found what I had fought for all along. Not to prove him wicked, but to prove myself steadfast. That Sunday, I attended service at St. Peter's, when the vestryman read aloud the Guild's new apprenticeship fund, naming it the Robert Ashwell Endowment for Honest Labor. A few heads turned toward me, their expressions soft. I felt a calm I had not known in years. It was not triumph, it was release. As I walked home along the river path, I passed the willow tree where grandfather used to rest. The branches swayed gently in the breeze, and for a moment, I could almost hear his voice again. "Remember, Margaret, power that hides in silence must one day answer to the sound of truth." I touched the bark, smiled faintly, and kept walking. The water carried on, tireless as time. Winter came quietly that year. The frost traced silver lines along the windows of Ashwell Mill, and each dawn found me walking the same worn path to the water's edge. The wheel turned slower in the cold, but it turned all the same, its steady rhythm matching the calm that had finally settled within me. The apprentices, 2 boys and a girl from the parish orphanage, worked under the steward's careful eye. Their laughter carried through the crisp air like a promise that the place would outlive us all. Inside the office, the ledgers stood in perfect order, each column neat, every signature clean. I often paused by the one marked Endowment Fund, 1480, its pages filled with small donations from the townsfolk and tradesmen who had once doubted me. They called it the mill that taught justice. I called it simply peace. Letters came from London, too. Clerks seeking guidance. Other women asking how to claim their dowries or property. I answered each in turn, careful, precise, and kind. I told them to keep copies, to witness their signatures, to never surrender their papers for trust alone. Proof, I wrote, is the quiet voice that cannot be silenced. One evening, as I sealed the last of these letters, the wind caught the door and swept a loose paper from my desk. The note Edmund had left before departing. I picked it up and read it again. The ink faded but steady. "You have won, Margaret. I hope it brings you peace." For the first time, I believed he meant it. Wherever he was, I hoped he had learned that peace is never taken by force. It is built one humble act at a time. I walked outside, lantern in hand, the lights soft against the snow. The town was quiet except for the sound of the river, faithful as ever. Across the water, I could see the glow of cottage windows, the homes of those who now worked here, lived here, believed again in honest labor. I knelt beside the willow and placed Edmund's letter beneath a stone, beside grandfather's resting place. "Rest easy," I whispered. The mill turned still. When I rose, the stars were scattered like filings of silver across the sky. I thought of all that had passed, the will reading, the forged papers, the trial, the whispers, and how they had forged me sharper than I'd ever wished to be. Yet standing there, I understood what my grandfather must have known when he wrote that final clause. That justice is not vengeance, and inheritance is not property. It is principle. The river flowed on, carrying away the last chill of bitterness. Tomorrow the apprentices would arrive early, eager to learn. Tomorrow the mill would grind anew. Tomorrow another woman somewhere might find courage in her own paper trail, her own voice. And that, I decided, would be legacy enough.